So, good evening, everyone. You're here in the right place. Tonight, Platypus, the Platypus Affiliated Society, will be hosting What's Left of History, a conversation hosted on the left for the left. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few remarks on the Platypus Affiliated Society, describe the panel structure, introduce our speakers, and then finally deliver the prompt. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006 at the University of Chicago, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old, which is the 1920s to 30s, new, 1960s to 70s, and post-political, 1980s to 90s, left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. The Platypus Affiliated Society holds reading groups, coffee breaks, and events like this one, all open to the public. For the DC chapter, this upcoming Sunday is an exception due to our international convention, but generally we hold a weekly reading group on every Sunday from 2 to 5 p.m. here in Georgetown University as an introduction to the history and legacy of revolutionary Marxism. We also hold informal coffee breaks to chat about news, politics, and the left at Georgetown on Wednesdays at 6:30 p.m., at George Washington University on Mondays at 6 p.m., and at George Mason University on Mondays at 3 p.m. You can find the details of these events on our social media or by joining our email list by putting down your email at the front of the room, so back there on that table, next to the free copies of the Platypus Review. Now, regarding panel structure. The panel is structured so that each panelist will have 10 minutes for their opening remarks. Panelists will then have 4 minutes each to respond to one another in the same order as their opening remarks. The floor will then be open to questions. Questions may be directed to a specific panelist or set of panelists or posed to the panel as a whole. Audience members interested in asking a question are encouraged to line up here on these steps. And I encourage asking only one question at a time and returning back in line if you have another question so that panelists can fully address each question that comes. We will then end with some brief closing remarks from the panelists in reflection of the discussion. Next, I'm pleased to introduce each of our speakers for tonight. Our first speaker will be Mike Golash. Mike Golash has been active in the revolutionary movement since the 1960s. He was at Columbia University in 1968 and was an organizer of the '68 student strike against the Vietnam War and racism. At that time, he joined the Progressive Labor Party. He moved to Washington in 1971 to help organize against the Vietnam War and build the PLP. He organized against the war until 1975, when the war ended, and then got a job for the transit agency working as a bus driver. He then helped organize a major strike in 1978 against Metro's refusal to pay cost of living raises to its transit union workers. He eventually became a shop steward, executive board member, financial secretary of the union, and eventually president of the union. He retired in 2010 as a member of ATU Local 689. Mike continues today to organize against war, racism, sexism, and for communist revolution and building the PLP. Our second speaker will be Greg Afinogenov. Greg Afinogenov is a professor at Georgetown and a tenant and labor organizer. He was once publicly denounced by Ajamu Baraka in a speech at an anti-imperialism conference in Hanoi. Our third speaker will be Leith Malhis. Leith Malhis is a graduate student at Georgetown University's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, where he studies settler colonialism and Palestinian health. His research develops the concept of de-healthification to describe the systematic dismantling and weaponization of healthcare systems in Palestine as a colonial strategy. His work has appeared in the New Arab, Al-Shabaka, and the Institute for Palestine Studies, where he serves as a researcher on the Healthcare Destruction Database. He will begin his PhD in history at the University of Toronto in the fall. Our final speaker will be Spencer Leonard. Spencer Leonard is a historian of India and the editor of Marx and Engels on Bonapartism and Imperialism, Selected Journalism. He is also professor of sociology at James Madison University and a founding member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. These four speakers will be addressing the question, What's left of history? Here's a prompt for the panel, which was shared with the panelists in advance. It begins with 2 quotes. But even regarding history as a slaughter bench at which the happiness of peoples, the wisdom of states, and the virtue of individuals have been victimized, the question involuntarily arises. To what principle, to what final aim these enormous sacrifices have been offered? This is Hegel from Lectures on the Philosophy of History. Follows a second quote. What characterizes revolutionary classes at their moment of action is the awareness that they are about to make the continuum of history explode. This is Walter Benjamin from On the Concept of History. Leftists, particularly Marxists, were confronted by both images of history in the past. History once appeared as something that must simultaneously be taken up and superseded in both radical thought and activity. Platypus asks whether this is still the case and what the stakes are of our relationship with history today through the following questions. What does it mean to learn from history? What role does a party play in maintaining the relationship of the present with the past? What is the relationship between history as a discipline and history for the left? Finally, what is the left compelled to remember and allowed to forget about the past? With that, Mike Golash, when you're ready, you may begin your opening remarks.
I read the introduction that there were some things. Okay. I read the introduction of things that I was supposed to talk about, and it really wasn't clear to me what it was all about, to tell you the truth. So I made up some remarks of my own, and I hope they're agreeable to what everyone says. First of all, like I've said, I've been an activist in the revolutionary movement for nearly 60 years. I've studied both the theory and the practice of revolutionary movements, from the Paris Commune to the Cultural Revolution and the various other national liberation struggles that have occurred in that period. Revolutionary movements must have a vision of the society they want to build. Fighting for national liberation or fighting for bread, land, and peace, as was done in the Russian Revolution, are not so sufficient to open the path to communism. Also, we also need an understanding of the internal contradictions of capitalism, which to win workers to make an effort to build a revolutionary movement. Understanding the labor theory of value and the concept of what the source of profits, which is the surplus value that workers create, is also important for workers to understand if they're to make and be won to a revolutionary movement. We also think that to actually build a revolutionary movement, you need to have a mass revolutionary party. Historical experiences show that a cadre party, like Lenin built, is not sufficient. It can make a revolution, but it cannot necessarily sustain one, nor it can lead to the transition to a communist society. You have to actually have a vision of what you're trying to accomplish. And the key elements of what a communist movement has to be about are: one, they have to be about abolishing the wage system. They have to win people to the idea that working for wages is a form of exploitation, that you go to work, you're paid enough money to get you back there the next day, but the surplus that you create is not controlled by you, it's not controlled by the working class, it's controlled by a capitalist. And they use that money to maintain their system. They use it to invest in production and expansion of production. They use it to create a state apparatus which can control and maintain the working class. They create an educational system to teach you about capitalism and the values of capitalism, the usefulness of it. So those are their ideas. And then of course they use a certain amount of it to live a very lavish lifestyle themselves. But that surplus, the source of profits, comes from the working class, and people have to understand that's why these people are rich and that's why we're relatively poor. Okay, so in each revolutionary movement that's occurred, I'd say basically looking back maybe to the Paris Commune, workers have learned certain lessons from those historical struggles. In the Paris Commune, workers understood that our leadership is subject to recall. If they don't do as we expect of them, we can replace them with other people. They also learned that the idea of workers running society is really an important concept, that having a group of well-to-do people, a sector run it, is not the direction in which we move. Then, of course, after the Paris Commune, the next big explosion was the Russian Revolution. And the problem with the Russian Revolution was that it was not made for communism. It was not made for a new set of social relationships. It was basically made for bread, land, and peace. End the war, everybody has a job, and basically the land is split up among the people, basically. So the idea of a classless society was not an idea held by the vast majority of people that participated in the revolution. And that was an underlying weakness of the whole movement. And then, of course, the next big explosion, of course, was the Chinese Revolution following the Second World War. And again, the vision of what we were trying to create was not held by a vast number of people who made that movement. They basically wanted to get rid of the landlords. They wanted to divide up the land. They wanted to provide a better life for the peasantry and the working class in China. But the vision of a communist future was not really held by a large number of people. I'm sure that Mao and the leadership of the communist movement had that vision, but it certainly wasn't spread to the masses of people, which is needed if you're going to transform society and transform the relationship that exists among people. Then, following that came the Cultural Revolution in China, which basically a certain section of the communist movement, a certain section of the party, began to realize that the direction which we were moving was not in the way of eliminating classes and developing a classless society. And many of the younger workers and students began to participate in that movement and began to say that China was not on the road to socialism and communism, but was rather moving in the opposite direction. Unfortunately, that movement was smashed. The People's Liberation Army was called out. The movement was smashed, and from there it was basically downhill for the next, up into the current period of time. So that was the lessons of that. Then throughout the 20th century, we had all the national liberation movements. The struggle in Algeria, the struggle in Vietnam, the struggle throughout Africa, the struggle in South America, the struggle in Cuba, and Nicaragua, and Venezuela, to liberate these countries from the control of an imperialist power, either be it England, be it the United States, be it France. And all those movements basically had a sort of nationalist component, that the national bourgeoisie, the elite in the particular country, allied with the working class, could break free of imperialism. And unfortunately, they did, in some ways, break through from one imperialist power, but they often wound up aligned with another one. And the idea of communism or socialism was never achieved. And over time, they reversed to a more, basically a more exploitive society. Not as bad as it maybe was as a colonial subject, but certainly nowhere near the vision of a classless, egalitarian society that was, the vision that we wanted them to have. So now we can say we have almost 200 years of mass struggles against capitalism, imperialism, and more recently fascism. Evaluating them, we must see the ability of the working class to rise up in rebellion. But what is needed to get beyond just simply rebellion is a mass revolutionary communist party which has a program which moves in that direction. And we have to look, where is the leadership for that going to come from? It's basically come from the working class, particularly from black and the more super exploited workers, who are the most serious victims of capitalist exploitation. So over the years, like I said in the initial, I became involved in two sort of major struggles. And what did I learn from those struggles? Well, the first struggle was at Columbia in 1968. And it was a period when there were many student rebellions. There was the French General Strike. There was the rebellions following the assassination of Martin Luther King. One of the lessons I learned from the Columbia Rebellion is the reason why we were more successful at Columbia than many other student struggles that were involved is that, one, we built an alliance with the community. We got together with the people in Harlem who were affected by gentrification and urban removal, and we built an alliance. We're going to fight Columbia's expansion. We're going to fight Columbia's efforts to take over your neighborhood park and use it for its students. And then we tied that together with the fight against the Vietnam War. So building that worker-student alliance, I think, was key to the fight. The next big struggle I got involved in was the 1978 metro strike. The lesson we learned there is that you have to fight racism if you're going to be successful in class struggle. Metro decided that as the workforce was transferred from a predominantly white workforce, which had been in the 1950s and 60s, to a predominantly black workforce in the 1970s, that the wage and benefit factor that they established for a mostly white workforce was no longer applicable. So we agitated around that. This is a racist attack, this effort to deny us our cost of living raise, which has been in place for 40 or 50 years, is an out-and-out racist attack. And we built an alliance between the older white workers, the younger black workers. We shut the city down for 6 days, and we managed to achieve maintenance of our cost of living raises. And for the last 40 years, we're probably the best paid transit workers, best pension transit workers, best healthcare benefited workers in the country. Of course, the bosses of the last few years have lost renewed attacks. That generation that led these struggles in the 60s and 70s are gone, or dead, and they feel they can get away with whatever they can. So, how many more time? About one more. I just want to say, May Day is coming up, May 1st. It's a chance for workers and students to join together to stand up against war, racism, and capitalism. We should all join in the May Day activities that are coming up on May 1st, 2nd, and 3rd in a month or so. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mike. I've only been on the organized left for about 10 years, so I can't compare it to your experience by any stretch. So I guess I just want to preface these remarks by saying that I am still very much committed to a communist horizon, but these come out of a kind of, broadly speaking, doomer mood that I have been feeling for the last few years, and I'm probably not alone in that. So I'm going to offer some ideas here that are possibly going to come off as trolling to many of you, and I just thought this would be a good space to do that. I promise that I'm genuine about these ideas, in that I think that they might be right. I am very interested in any counter-arguments you might have, though, because I would like to be wrong. So briefly, what I want to argue is that Francis Fukuyama was right, and history is mostly over, just not in the way that he thought it was. And here is why. So at a high level of abstraction, we can divide human history into 3 unequally sized phases divided by 2 watersheds. The first watershed is the making of peasants, which took place over the course of a period starting from the invention of agriculture in the Middle Ages in most places, and in the 19th century in a few others. And the second watershed is the unmaking of peasants, which began in the 16th century in some places and is still ongoing in some other places, although for most humans it's probably over by approximately the year 2000. So by peasants I mean mostly agricultural producers, sometimes fishermen, that kind of thing, who exist in some sort of bonded or quasi-bonded relationship to a landowner or to the state, and whose surplus is mostly extracted by their lords rather than reinvested in production. So today I'm not going to talk much about how peasants were made, because that's not a topic most Marxists are that interested in. But I'm going to talk about how they were unmade. And so there are 4 ways to unmake peasants. The first is what we often call enclosure. That's a process by which a peasantry is converted into a mass of wage laborers through the growth of capitalist relations in agriculture, thus releasing surplus agricultural labor to go to the cities to try to find work. And this is what happened in, say, England starting around 1500. The second way is settler colonialism, in which formerly landless migrants are enabled to become small-scale capitalist farmers and or wage laborers in a colonial setting. And in this context, they sometimes retain peasant lifeways, but for 1 or 2 generations, but probably not longer. Now here's where it gets more interesting. The third way to unmake peasants is a revolution led by a socialist party that then embarks on a developmentalist project. The fourth way is a developmentalist project pursued by a right-wing regime. And there might be some combination of these 4 ways, and I want to say that all 4 of these ways of unmaking are exceptionally violent, and in some cases even genocidal. And we can think about the slow violence of enclosure, we can think about collectivization in the Soviet Union, we can think about the Great Leap Forward in China, we can think about the killing of communists in Indonesia. There are any number of possible examples we can bring. So all 4 of these processes are responsible for the world we live in today. The historical purpose of Marxist political parties is simply the unmaking of peasants into wage laborers. Once they start to run out of peasants, communist regimes become effectively indistinguishable from capitalist societies. No society significantly composed of proletarians, let alone hereditary proletarians, has ever had a revolution, and none ever will. Historically speaking, hereditary proletarians are identical to what Lenin would call labor aristocrats, and the more hereditary they are, the more true that is. They can build unions and pursue social reforms of various kinds, but they will never successfully win power in a revolution, and the vast majority of them don't even want to. Peasants, on the other hand, are inherently revolutionary. Almost every peasant society regularly experiences violent uprisings and millenarian movements. Peasants, unlike hereditary proletarians, have little to lose but their chains. Furthermore, in societies where agriculture has attained a certain level of productivity, peasants have high birth rates and lower childhood death rates and therefore become very numerous very quickly, producing a critical mass of angry young people, as happened in Russia and China. So once you start to run out of peasants, history is effectively over. You might transition between different regimes of production. We might talk about Fordism to neoliberalism, for example. But there's no longer any scope for a revolutionary transformation of society that would fundamentally alter most people's livelihoods. Once you're a wage laborer, or a capitalist farmer, or a property owner, you're a wage laborer. The unmaking of peasants is simply the imposition of the law of value on the bulk of the population. So for those of us in the global north, history has ended. It has recently ended in China. It is beginning to end in Southeast Asia. In much of Africa and Latin America, the situation is a bit more complicated, and we can talk about that later. And this is not a way of saying in a new left kind of mode that peasant revolutions in the third world will destroy capitalism. In fact, the communist parties of Southeast Asia are the backbone of global capitalism today, and their proletarianizing peasant populations are its bone marrow. From a communist perspective, we can say that it wasn't that the vanguard parties have failed, or that the revolution didn't happen in the West. It did happen. It just took longer, and it unfolded in a different way. And there is no reason to expect another one, because the social prerequisites are getting more rather than less remote. So how do we know history has ended? There is one phenomenon affecting human societies all over the globe today, and that is the falling birth rate. No society, regardless of its form of government or economic structure, has found a way to reverse the demographic transition, although some have managed to accelerate it, like China. Demographic transition correlates more or less directly to how fully a particular society has unmade its peasants. High birth rates are a feature of a peasant economy, because in a peasant economy, every additional child is a direct source of economic surplus. You can put a 4-year-old to work herding sheep. This does not apply to post-peasant economies, where children must be supported and educated at great expense before they begin to be economically productive. Actually, so demographers have some arguments about this last point. We can talk about that later, if we want to. So events are going to keep happening, but for a growing number of us, history is over. Every revolutionary society in history has had a demographic structure that heavily favored young people. Aging societies are politically conservative, obsessed with the past, fixated on protecting already secured gains rather than seeking new ones. As the lifespans of capitalists grow longer, they offer fewer and fewer barriers to the indefinite accumulation of capital. To ensure class reproduction and economic growth, these societies depend more and more heavily on labor-saving technology designed and owned by capitalists. No one has yet found a way of altering that equation, so as far as I can tell, the future of the world is managed demographic decline, if nuclear war and climate change don't take us out first. Thank you for your attention.
I agree.
Pessimistic.
So I also see I'm Palestinian, and so my way of looking at the left is a little different, because I think in actively resisting genocide, I'm more pessimistic, and in the sense that I'm in survival mode. And survival mode is often drenched in melancholy and this idea of that we just have to endure. A lot of us are exhausted. I wrote this. I've been working on this. I did present this at the Middle East Studies Association. This little spiel, thinking about Saidiya Hartman and Black studies, Black theorists, because I think what Palestinians and Arabs and those that are living in the Arab world today are dealing with are a project of annihilation or subjugation. And because of the inherent resistance that is within the region, there won't be subjugation. There'll just be annihilation. Like any colonized and occupied people, Arabs and specifically Palestinians have often chosen the route to resist or be annihilated rather than just to accept subjugation. And so I wanted to think about where history plays in all of this, and as history writers and those collecting history, because we are privileged in the West to have at least some sort of space and safety from bombs raining down on us, to be able to narrate what's what's being orated by people in regions that are warscapes, using Sami Hermez's terminology. So I want to begin with Saadia Hartman because some of her words really touched to me. And she writes, and I'm quoting her, "Every generation confronts the task of choosing its past. Inheritances are chosen as much as they're passed on. The past depends less on what happened then than on the desires and discontents of the present. Strivings and failures shape the stories we tell. What we recall has as much to do with the terrible things we hope to avoid as with the good life for which we yearn for." And that quote stays with me, especially as this genocide is unfolding. And this brings me to the question of what is left of history. Not politically, but what is left of history? And what are we compelled to remember and allowed to forget? And so I read and study and write on the Arab world, and I don't see the Arab world, isolated within the colonized post-colonial world. Teaching and writing on this at this moment has moved far beyond the idea of scholarship. It's really a political project, and it's a project of survival. And it's really become a project of longing and returning and to holding close to the worlds that we come from. At least in Washington, D.C., of all places, studying the Arab world has become my own form of resistance and my own jihad. And I'm not scared to say it, because jihad is an idea of struggle. And we are in constant struggle. And for me, scholarship is a form of struggle. And it's become a space where we insist that our histories and the languages matter, and that our people are to be cherished, and that they deserve the dignity of a careful, loving study. But to understand why this work feels so urgent, we have to name the fragmentation that is being imposed on us. The Arab world and the colonized world, it feels really scattered today. Borders have hardened, as we've seen with the war in Lebanon specifically today. The mobility has collapsed, and communities are being torn apart, and I mean that literally. You know how many times I've woken up over the last 3 years watching torn bodies? Yeah. And yet studying the region has given us a way to understand that fragmentation differently. We've come to see the genocide, and that's where my own work comes from, as not a beginning, or actually the end, but really one long chapter of a painful colonial genealogy. When I talk about that genealogy, I talk just as much about that resistance, and there's always that dialectic, and that moment of unity that has accompanied every act of violence. As the violence enacted on the Arab world and the colonized world has a history, so does our resistance. And that's something that our foreparents have insisted on. And much of the written word from the native and the orated word has also pushed us backwards. And so that's what's our responsibility, is to look at what has been missed from historical documentation. And for me, I'm looking at how our parents and our grandparents and their generations tied to them, how they've repaired themselves, specifically to today. How they understood themselves and how they built unity amongst themselves. How they dreamt and how they faltered. Because really how they faltered is how we can also scheme for our future. Their victories and their failures and their impossible decisions, that too is our inheritances. But Hartman also reminds us that inheritances are chosen. And what happens when the archive we inherit is one that insists on our erasure. Over the last few weeks, I've been looking at the Zionist archive, particularly to understand the obscurities. And so, addressing the challenges of what to do with the indigenous inhabitant of the land, Chaim Weizmann, a Russian Jew, said that at the World Zionist Congress in 1921 that Palestinians are akin to the, quote, rocks of Judea, obstacles that have to be cleared on a difficult path. Ben Gurion, who is a Polish Jew who happens to change his name to Ben Gurion to seem relevant in the region and to have a sense of belonging in the region, said, and I quote, "We must expel the Arabs and take all their places." There are thousands of these conversations among early Zionists who plotted and implemented the violent colonization of Palestine and the annihilation of her native people. And but they were only partially successful. This is where I am really trying to look at too, because the Zionist project hasn't succeeded really. When people like Benny Morris, the genocidal maniac that is on the syllabuses of many professors at Georgetown that teach on Palestine, they often say that the project hasn't finished. So that's where I'm really finding solace from. Morris, he expressed the idea that Ben-Gurion never finished the job, and that's what's holding Israel back today. Benjamin Netanyahu also bemoaned a missed opportunity when he was looking at the Telemans Square. He said that we lost the opportunity to expel the Arabs. And so that's also part of the archive, and that's how we look at it differently. And so I'm thinking about what it means to inherit history under the conditions where your elimination is openly theorized and debated and refined. And so the question is not as simple as what happened and how it's narrated, how it's remembered, and who's permitted to define its terms. As historians, our task is to be meticulous, but also to be radical in how we approach that archive, to push the bounds of how history is written, to refuse the limits imposed on what can be said, what can be seen, and what can be remembered, to read against that grain of an archive that documents our disappearance as policy, as debate, and as reason, to treat these records as not a neutral evidence, but really as blueprints for our elimination, to insist that history is not passive, but a terrain of struggle, a terrain of jihad, because what is being produced again and again is a past in which Palestinian life is rendered disposable over and over and over. There is that even in well-intentioned historians, there's this often disposability of Palestinians as going to be eliminated. Because I have 2 minutes, I'm going to jump on Ghassan Abu Sitta, who I highly recommend that you look at, because he is calling for us to rehistoricize the falter of the Palestinian liberation movement. He looks at the idea, the biosphere of genocide, and it's quite interesting because he talks about it as a biological, social biosphere where people live, where their conditions work separately in a synergy to reshape human health in a way that takes lives or diminishes his life. Within that, the biosphere, water is destroyed, sewage is destroyed, epidemics are created, famine is created, and overcrowding is created, conditions of overcrowding are creating. And then all these conditions converge, the physical, the biological, the social, and they become a system. And then you destroy the nodal points. You kill the doctors, you destroy the hospitals, and once that biosphere is established, you sit back and let the work do. And that's what's happening in Palestine. And for us, it's imperative that we look at that structure and disrupt it. Disrupt that slow violence that's going to now happen in Palestine and in places like Lebanon and in places like Congo and places like Sudan. And then his way to interject for us as historians to look at how the clinic has become central, because the clinic is where the system can be interrupted, where the body can be repaired, where the mark of violence can be contested, and where the colonized refuses to remain a testament of colonial power. The role of clinic is to disrupt that alienation and to join that history, to kind of retie that history, to undo the inscription and to reconnect the body into a community, to transform the wound from a mark of domination into a site of resistance. And this is why the clinic is feared, and this is why in Gaza the clinic has been the central point to target. Because it allows the past to be carried forward in living bodies. And I'm almost done. I just have a few lines. And I want us to really, for us, what needs to happen is that we need to understand that the global capital is no longer in a position or no longer wants to come to any accommodation with us. Therefore, it has really repositioned the tools of liberalism, and it's now dealing purely in terms of violence and linguistics and epistemic and political and the military. There's no halfway point. There's no Oslo or Madrid for Palestinians where we were decapitated, as Edward Said likes to call it. That was the Treaty of Versailles for Palestinians. And we also need to understand the surplus of populations that have zero economic need and are eliminated either through genocide or social murder. We need to understand this moment is crucial, not just for Palestinians, but globally. And so I return to Harman, this is where I conclude. Every generation confronts the task of choosing its past. In moments where the archive is saturated with violence, where the body itself becomes an archive, where the street is being erased, the question becomes sharper. What do we choose to remember? What do we refuse to forget? And what do we carry forward? So that there is something left of history, something left to inherit, something left to restore. Thank you.
in some sense, I've been haunted by a remark that I heard a young person make about 10 or 12 years ago at the Left Forum in New York City. I don't even know if we still hold the Left Forum. It's something that Stanley Aronowitz and others in New York founded. And it was a panel on the Bolshevik Revolution. And in the discussion, the young person raised their hand and said, in effect, I'm paraphrasing, "Isn't it good that they didn't succeed, because a revolution then could only have been the triumph of white supremacy?" And I want to raise that question of the legacy of the old revolution. My argument here is that the epoch of socialism and of the American Revolution are coextensive. Equally, the long 19th century, the period of Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, and Adam Smith, to that of Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky. In that period, there was, and was known to be, something called history, but that is no more. 85 years ago, really writing already in the wake of history, Walter Benjamin wrote, as if to remember, what characterizes revolutionary classes at the moment of action, at their moment of action, is the awareness that they are about to make the continuum of history explode. This year marks the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, of the project, in Thomas Paine's immortal phrase, to begin the world anew. As he wrote, anticipating Benjamin, we have every opportunity and every encouragement before us. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. A situation similar to the present hath not happened since the days of Noah until now. The birthday of a new world is at hand. The reflection is awful, by which he means full of awe. And in this point of view, how trifling, how ridiculous do the little paltry cavillings of a few weak or interested men appear when weighed against the business of a world. It was and is indeed an awful reflection and prospect. Yet the left will not only fail to mark the occasion, it will protest the celebration of the American Revolution this year. You can count on that. What passes for the left has broken fundamentally with the Enlightenment and the freedom project that sits at the heart of modern revolution, all modern revolution. As we all know, the left is now racialist and nationalist, even to the point of defending any despotism that suppresses its people in the name of supposedly resisting the prevailing American-dominated world state. Still, the left's cussed rejection of its own revolutionary legacy expresses a dim apprehension that something is amiss. While the American Revolution has never been unmistakably defeated, neither can it be said to endure. The American Revolution is dead because socialism is dead, so that when the dead left struggles against the American Revolution, it's a ghost's restless struggle with itself. The defeat of Marxism over a century ago took place in Europe, and the American Revolution was engulfed in the common ruin. The process began at the time of the crisis within Marxism known as the revisionist dispute, for which, indeed, the Spanish-American War was one occasion, the Boer War was another, the long boom of the 1890s still another. But revisionism did not fully consume the socialism inherited from the 19th century until the Stalinization of the world communist movement and the concomitant process of social democracy's self-subordination to capitalist politics was accomplished. And the so-called American century that ensued after socialism's self-defeat stands outside of history. History is a project of freedom That project, as Paine suggests, is one of not simply realizing the past, much less simply knowing it, but of reckoning with it and superseding it. It is a project of, as he puts it, realizing a new world. As Paine put it, it is a new project, one that seeks to wash the past clean, as the biblical flood washed clean the earth in Noah's time. As modern, it is the project of overcoming the very biblical world of the Noah myth, the precarious agricultural civilization, with its floods, its growth and decay, its helplessness in the face of nature, its peasants. The American Revolution announced the prospect of a society inaugurated by the Neolithic Revolution coming to master human nature itself, both objectively and subjectively. Though the revolution spread to, but was defeated in Europe throughout the 19th century, the American Republic stood as the great reminder that world history was not extinguished. As for Europe, it was understood that, though the Great French Revolution was defeated, even the counter-revolution was no mere reversal, but was a continuation of it, despite itself. And the entire first generation of socialists understood the inherent connection between the American and the European Revolution. Saint-Simon had fought as a captain under the Marquis de Lafayette in the American Revolution, playing a crucial role in displaying great bravery at the Battle of Yorktown. And America was the home of the only Fourierist and Owenite socialist communities, New Harmony in Indiana, Brook Farm in Massachusetts, the Colts Neck, New Jersey phalansterie, and that in Ripon, Wisconsin, which is also the birthplace of the Republican Party, were all sites of great experiments of the earliest socialists. And of course, Robert Owen's son helped to establish that great People's Institute in this city, the Smithsonian. The Transatlantic Republic was also the great refuge of European revolutionaries, especially German revolutionary immigrants, of whom many were comrades of Marx and Engels from the Communist League. Not far from here, as Blaine and I know, we went to visit it, at the cemetery of the Battle of Antietam lay in turn thousands of German-American revolutionaries whose sacrifice on the altar of the revolution led 5 days later to the issuance of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. When, after 14 years of abstention from revolutionary politics, Marx participated crucially in the foundation of the International Working Men's Association, one of his first tasks was to pen the letter congratulating the American people on the re-election of Abraham Lincoln, formally acknowledging thereby that the Union's midwifing of a new birth of freedom in the 1860s was a legacy to the workers of the world. When Lincoln was assassinated in the following year, the first large demonstration against the regime of Louis Bonaparte fought soldiers in the streets of Paris, demanding that the people be allowed to offer the American ambassador their condolences. Around the same time, Marx and Engels' close comrade, Joseph Wedemeyer, before his untimely death in 1866, linked the struggle for black rights with broader labor reforms, such as the 8-hour workday, viewing the emancipation of labor and the end of slavery as inherently interconnected projects. And the International Working Men's Association, formed to give direction and transform the deeply felt European solidarity with the Union cause, proceeded to establish Marxism as the leading current in international socialism, a process that culminated in Marx's splitting of the International on the question of solidarity with the Paris Commune. The late 19th and early 20th century emergence of mass political parties for socialism, ultimately of the World Party for Socialism that we call the Second International, understood itself as the direct heir to Marx's First International and indeed of his splitting of the First International. At the founding Congress of the Second International, at which many American socialists were present, International Workers' Day was declared to commemorate the Haymarket Massacre that took place in Chicago 3 years before. Everyone knew in Paris in 1889 that American socialism carried the hopes of the world. As Friedrich Engels wrote in the same year as the Haymarket Massacre, the tendency of the capitalist system towards the ultimate splitting up of society into two classes works nowhere with greater force than in America. Accordingly, the working class movement in America has started with truly American vigor. And as on that side of the Atlantic, things march with at least double the European speed, we may yet live to see America take the lead in this respect too.
Spencer, the time is at 2 minutes.
When finally the Second International made the October and November revolutions in 1917 and 1918 respectively, ultimately collapsing after a failed attempt at orderly retreat, the modern revolution itself collapsed. With it, and though for a brief moment it seemed that Marxism might, after the catastrophe of 1933, recover itself in the United States, the American Revolution collapsed too. Thus, for instance, consolidation of the so-called imperial presidency is best understood as a process that runs parallel from the revisionist dispute to the collapse of socialism, from William McKinley through Teddy Roosevelt to Woodrow Wilson, to its culmination in FDR's institutionalization of the modern executive as the apotheosis of the authoritarian state. This, even as America never undergoes a counter-revolution per se. So, there's an epoch of history in which history itself was actual, understood as a project of freedom. The project of making history once existed. Cognizant of the danger of overspecification, still, we can designate this as the period roughly of a century and a half from 1776 to 1919. The period from the American Revolution, which was never just American, to the defeat of the German Revolution, a defeat that was not just German. Within that period, however, history, in the sense of the unfolding of Geist, does not remain the same. Rather, with class struggle, with industrial revolution, and the revolution of 1848, with, in a word, the dawn of what Marx calls capital, sometime in the second quarter of the 19th century, the dialectic of history was given a twist. The dialectic itself becomes self-undermining, self-disintegrative, even as that disintegration of history points towards the complete overcoming of history itself. In the age of capital, bourgeois society and bourgeois historical dialectic, described by, above all, Hegel, are radically transformed. Bourgeois society realizes itself through massive growth, even as it derealizes itself through mass unemployment, crime, and the other morbid symptoms of capital that call forth the reemergence of the state over and against society to manage it over and over again.
Thank you for all the introductory remarks. Now we'll be moving into 4-minute responses from each of our panelists to the other panelists' introductory remarks. So starting with Mike Golash.
Okay, first of all, I think the idea that the proletarian will never make revolution is fundamentally wrong. We've lived in a period where capitalism has developed and made possible a better world for many, many workers, basically, with all sort of modern scientific developments, agricultural production, etc., etc. But it's also created the First World War, in which probably 20 million people died. It created the Second World War, which probably close to 100 million people died. And now with the threat of climate disaster and nuclear war, another inter-imperialist war, the working class really has no choice but to try and organize itself into a revolutionary force and bring about the end of capitalism and imperialism. I mean, so, yes, it's been nice this last, post-World War II period for many, many workers, particularly in the advanced capitalist countries, and even in some of the development countries. But that period seemed to be rapidly coming to an end. And we have a crazy guy like Trump running this country, sort of essentially a fascist dictator running Russia, and the Chinese government basically becoming more and more an imperialist power, investing all around the world, developing a military apparatus comparable to the United States. It opens the door for us to educate millions and millions of working people that the current system of imperialism and inter-imperialist rivalry cannot provide a decent life for the working people of the world. One of the things about the Palestinian movement, one of its weaknesses from day one, it has never adopted a real class outlook on the nature of the struggle in Palestine. I had this argument with Edward Said 50 years ago that, you need to reach out to the working class in Palestine. Forget about the Yasser Arafats and these other petty bourgeois forces, which will always compromise with Zionism in one way or another. You have to build a base in the working class. You have to try and reach out to those elements of the Israeli population which are workers and which are not completely infected with this Zionist virus, and build a working class movement to build a multiracial, non-religious society which can meet the needs of all the people that live in that region. And the last thing, this thing about sort of almost glorifying the Second International, which to me is sort of ridiculous. And the Second International did everything it could to undermine the building of a revolutionary movement. It supported its own national bourgeoisies in the First World War, and it basically did its best to try and undermine the construction of socialism in the Soviet Union. And that's, to me, a real crime. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, Mike, of course I admire your work. I think for me, my remarks are kind of inspired by a sense of frustration because the left has been saying that that's the solution to the problem for the last 70 years, and that hasn't really worked. And so, there's a way that people talked in the late Soviet period where they would identify a problem and then they would always immediately say that the solution to the problem is doing more of the stuff that caused the problem in the first place. And I think I'm kind of, this isn't just the left, like our entire society is just doing this now constantly. But I'm frustrated, and so I'm trying to find a way to think about this in a new way. I don't know. So in terms of the Palestinian stuff, I do think there's a connection here, right? Because Israel itself is the product of what you offer, first to the penniless Jewish masses of the Pale of Settlement, right? This land that you can take and make bloom or whatever, as long as you can kill the people who live there, all the way up until, the Ethiopians and, invite them into the project as well. And I think the creation of surplus populations is inherent to the project of transforming peasants into wage laborers, whether those peasants are the victims of the surplusification or someone else is the victim. And the same thing, of course, happened in the United States, which the American revolutionaries eagerly participated in. I definitely agree that there is a historical continuity between the revolutionary projects of the American Revolution and the socialist one, and definitely people acknowledged that at the time. I would say the way to think about that, though, is that they were all participating in different sides of the same project, whether the communists or whether the Bolsheviks or Rosa Luxemburg or whoever. And I think the lesson of that is that ultimately they were successful, and we can take pride in what they accomplished and mourn what they failed to accomplish, which is everything else.
Yeah, I would say onto the point about the strategy for Palestine, I think for often too long, and actually the entire history of the Palestinian national movement, there has never been the giving Palestinians total sovereignty and total ownership over their movement and over their strategy. It's, of course, there's criticisms to be levied to the Palestinian elite in the 30s and 40s, and as well with Arafat. However, I do think that these people have been co-opted because of this, because of their because the Palestinians have never had ownership over their land, and so they're in fact, I do think that this is something that Said did miss, and many of us miss, that there is a need to mobilize the masses in Palestine. However, they do need to be led, unfortunately, by the Palestinian elites in the West Bank. I mean, when the Palestinian elites in the West Bank do get off their asses, there is an actual you do see a unity strategy. I mean, 2021 was one of the foremost, was the moment of unity in Palestine that hasn't been felt since the 1987. And that's because the masses the young masses of Jerusalemite elites did come out and protested. However, again, they were co-opted again by the Americans and the Arab regimes in suppressing the mass mobility. Sorry, I'm really tired. I'm on 3 hours of sleep. But I do want to say that there just needs to be total ownership given to Palestinians. That us outside of Palestine, even myself, I consider myself a diaspora, though I grew up in the West Bank. I'm not the person to be telling Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza what to do, how to mobilize, your strategies. My job here is to weaken the American empire and to kind of allow it to self-destruct enough so it can, take its sort of its footprint, its boot off the region. The Arabs in the region, currently the younger generation, is well enough, competent enough to mobilize and to revolt. It's just its necks are pressured and they're suffocating. Our job here as leftists, and I think that's the job of leftists, is to destroy the society that we live in, because it's not going to be reformed. Destroy in a way where you weaken it, the longer there is a Mamdani in every area, I'm not a big fan of him, but the longer there is a more Mamdani in every area, in the US, the country destroys itself because it can't operate having, people call for socialist policies. That's not, the American system is not built for that. Yeah, I mean, I'm really sorry, I'm butchering my words today, I'm really tired, but basically what to take away from this is that you just need to weaken the American empire to allow those in the region to have full capability potential to mobilize.
Yeah, maybe it just needs to be stated a little more bluntly. The greatest, really the only viable project for socialism was Eurocentric. It was centered in Europe. And the failure of that is something that we still suffer from. The idea that it's glorifying the Second International is a real problem in understanding the Russian Revolution or the October Revolution. The October Revolution is made by the Second International. It's not made by the Third International. The Third International doesn't exist. World War I was brought to an end by an outbreak of European revolution that was a part of a strategy for world revolution. World War II ended in misery and nuclear war, and to the extent that there was revolution, it was a peasant revolution in China that had no consequence for the rest of the world. Right? I think it's a real travesty to say that the diaspora should not tell Palestinians what to do. We have opportunities here that they will never have in Palestine. We need to build a mass political movement for socialism in the United States and in the core of capitalism. It will transform the entire circumstance in Palestine and Israel. It's the only thing that will, actually. It will transform the politics of the entire world. It will transform the Hindutva movement in India. It will transform Islamism. It is the only way to achieve socialism. What's it say? And we need to produce Palestinian revolutionaries here in America. right? We've got a lot of Palestinians here. And they have greater opportunities here. They have educational opportunities. They can think about the history of the left, as is happening, of course. And there's absolutely no reason why we should wait for what is actually a population that's in extremely dire circumstances, right? That faces, obviously in Gaza, we're not going to see any significant political mobilization. It couldn't possibly happen under those circumstances. And, I lived in Ramallah when I was young, and Ramallah is nothing like it used to be, right? When I went back there, the Palestinian working class had significantly collapsed. They were no longer working in Israel as they were when I was 14 and 15 and lived in Ramallah, and they were going into Jerusalem every day, right? The political opportunities there are much, much diminished, even from what they were leading into the First Intifada. But on a broader scale, the idea that the American left needs to cheerlead the development of some movement somewhere else, rather than to develop the capacities, the organization, and the intellectual leadership, socialist leadership in the United States, is an immense failure. It's an immense failure. And it's been going on for a very long time, substituting anti-colonial revolution, third world revolution, for revolution in the core of capitalism is a strategy for failure, and it's been actively promoted by rotten leftism.
Okay. Is there a moment to respond after?
Questions?
I think we're going to go to questions, but I'm sure the questions are going to address the topic, so that may be the best time. But yes, it's time for questions, and I encourage those who have questions about this fruitful panel to come line up, and I can hand you the mic.
Thank you for this discussion. I wanted to ask about the relationship between the left and our knowledge of history, in the sense of whether the organized political left has made it easier for us to understand history, or has helped us to remember history in a certain light. So, Mike, I hear you kind of, reflecting on the history of, the 19th and 20th century political struggles for socialism, and what those might have, enabled us to see as, possibilities not taken or foreclosed, that we might not be able to see if there hadn't been revolutionaries in Russia in 1917. And Greg, I think I hear you saying, as you said in your response, that we just, workers have been trying to make the revolution for 70 years, or leftists have been saying that the workers didn't make the revolution for 70 years, and it hasn't worked. And so maybe we need to rethink, in light of this failure, maybe we need to rethink the Marxist dictum that history is the history of class struggle. Maybe history appears to us now as this other thing, right? Like peasantification and de-peasantification, which points sort of negatively to, how the failure of the left in the 20th century might make human history on the grand scale appear differently to us. And then Spencer and Leith, I'm struck by how deep your agreement is. That history of the Palestinian struggle is that there's an opacity to it, in light of Leith, as you say, the kind of the absences or the gaps in the archive, because of course every generation has to choose what to remember, and the Palestinians didn't get to make that choice. It was made for them by an occupying force. And so there's a kind of, because there's been maybe an inability, whether it's control of the land or the failure of the elites in the West Bank. There's been a kind of inability to provide this opportunity for choosing what history to remember. And Spencer, I see you pointing also to the same kind of absence. So I guess, sorry, it's a long-winded question, but just reflecting on kind of this theme coming up in the panel, I want to ask, like, was there, have the vicissitudes of the political left over the last 200 years affected, how, what it seems salient to us to remember in history today?
I mean, well, I joined the Progressive Labor Party basically because I felt they made an effort to understand the failures of the revolutionary movement of the last 150 years. We've come to the conclusion that the idea that socialism is an intermediary step towards communism is not true. As long as you preserve a wage system, you're going to always have some people that are making more than others, and those people that make more than others are eventually going to evolve into a new ruling class. And we've seen that happen in every so-called socialist country that's existed in the world. So abolishing the wage system has to be a key part of your program. Second of all, the whole concept that nationalism can be a progressive force. We've seen that this does not work. Wherever there's been nationalist movements coming to power, they basically broke away from one imperialist power and went to another one and used that as an excuse for maintaining their own rule. So, so nationalism, it does not lead to a more progressive society, basically. And the last point is that there's a number of countries that people think of in some ways as being socialist countries. North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, and I'll name a few others, but to us, those are not socialist countries. Those people have returned to capitalism. They have a class structure. They produce commodities. They don't produce to meet people's needs. And, so we've learned that lesson. We're not going to follow that same course. We're trying to develop a new path which we can be more successful in sustaining our revolutionary enthusiasm and transform society, do away with exploitative relationships, and build more collective relationships among working people.
I think left history is a nightmare that weighs like an incubus in the brains of the living, especially living leftists. I mean, it's really like this libidinal identification with Marx, with the Bolsheviks, with Mao, with all of these historical forces that you just desperately need to cling to. Like, oh, we need to redo what Mao did. We need to redo what Trotsky did. All of this stuff. I'm so sick of it. It's over. We live in a new world, and we have to figure out what that new world looks like. And that world does not look like the world of 1917 or the world of 1945 or 1933. And it just will not. History doesn't move backwards. And I think, to me, the call that represents is a call to reassess what is the real movement to change the real state of things, right? And that real movement doesn't really exist in the way that Marxists understood them. And so we have to make sense of what that means in reality and what the prospects are for that. And I think, the question of, like, is China socialist? Was Soviet Russia socialist? I think these things are, maybe we can just say that is what socialism used to be. Like, that's what it was. That's what the historical project turned into. And maybe there wasn't anything else to be found there. Maybe that was what that particular line of historical development led to. And it would be great to have something better. But whether that's going to have anything in common with what the Bolsheviks were trying to accomplish, I think it's unlikely.
Yeah, I do want to say thank you, Spencer, for your, because I appreciate what you said in the sense that you woke some sort of feather in me. And a few years ago, I would take that sort of stance, saying as a diaspora, it's on me, it's on Palestinians here. But we are, in the West, we are poisoned. We are poisoned. We cannot go back, I cannot go back and let go of my lived conditions, the things that I've seen, the things that I've been conditioned because I am living in the United States and I'm living in Canada. Ontologically, I am corrupted. And that is the same thing when the minute the PLO became internationally recognized and opened into the halls of Geneva and New York, Arafat was poisoned. And it's the same thing with the Husseini. Right after the recognition in the Arab high, these people were dealing with the Brits. They were, by association, never going to be take the moral stance for their people. To say also, you opened on Eurocentrism, which is potent, but that line of thinking is also Eurocentric. To say that we are the ones who can educate these diasporas to go and liberate their people. I'm going to be honest with you. This is the thing that I talk about, like endurance. I am struck by Palestinians who live in Ramallah. Of course, it is a city that's been NGOized and co-opted, and it's riddled with corrupt money and collaborationists. But the people that live there, the young generation, also have that sort of like anger at what they see, and they navigate occupation. They manage occupation in the sense that there's a road check today on Mahmoud Darwish Street. How am I gonna get around it? They're not passive people that are like, I'm gonna call I'm gonna talk to the Israelis. No, they're gonna find other ways. They're gonna use the taxi driver that has a cartographic memory and a counter-cartographic memory that we're going to around this area that Google Maps or the Israeli Waze app doesn't show you. I think there is something there for us to appreciate about them and to just set the conditions, because these people want freedom just as much as you want freedom. These people want to live and they want to defeat the occupier just as much as you do.
Of course.
And I think that I'm not in any position. If I go home to Nablus today and I was I was educated at Georgetown University, you need to listen to me, I would be shot at and I would be supporting that. Because here's the thing, they're like, what have you seen? What have you lived under? You left. And that is part of that exiled experience that Edward Said also appreciated. Yes, he had criticisms and he spoke in a very elitist language. But when it came to talking about resistance, when it came talking about giving Palestinian sovereignty, Said and those who live in exile will tell you, it is not on us to tell Palestinians, I correct myself, it is not to tell the occupier, the third world, how to live their lives. And it is a sort of, I actually see it as a litmus test on how you speak to these people, how you see them as equals. Because when we say that, we can incubate, the West can be an incubator for these revolutionaries and these nationalists to go back and to deconstruct the Israeli project, it kind of just shows that you're also entrenched in Eurocentrism. And it's not a fault of the individual. That's the structure that we live in, where it constantly lives because we speak of it in leftist circles. It's everywhere. It's a poison. And so I think we just need to defeat the American empire and to remove the funding it gives to Israel. Because I swear to you, the minute Israel and any authoritarian state in the region loses its funding, they collapse the morning of. I promise you. And we'll see. I mean, Lebanon's not going to be successful because the Americans don't have enough money to give Israel to continue to annex Lebanon and to continue its occupation in Lebanon. It takes massive amount of money to control a territory that's hostile. And the Israelis won't be able to because the Americans have been weakened by Trump. And again, think about the petrodollar, what's going to happen. I mean, there is now a shift in the petrodollar that we're not really thinking about. The American military is not going to be able to sustain itself because its position among the petrodollar is not as strong as it was a few years ago because of what Trump did with the Iranians, the Strait of Hormuz. But anyways, I mean, that's geopolitical talk.
I agree strongly that nationalism is no way forward. And I think it has possessed the mind of the left for a very long time, really since the collapse of socialism in Europe. What I want to say is that, and what I was trying to emphasize, I strongly agree with the doom-pilled perspective here, right? I'm entirely open to it. At the same time, what I would say is this: we don't really get to choose what we remember. we don't really have that freedom. History weighs upon the present. The present is the past unfolding. It isn't the case that we simply get, if we could forget it, that would be tantamount to overcoming capitalism. Capitalism is the inheritance of the past. It is the past still with us, and most fundamentally, it's the past in the form of the social relations that Mike was talking about, right? That, and this is where I would want to go. I don't think that there's ever going to be a revolution that is made by a majority of people with an articulate vision of ending the wage system. I don't think that that's possible or viable. What I think there is bourgeois revolution unfolding all the time. We just lived through a massive bourgeois revolution, right? It's called the crisis in global politics since the emergence of Trump and Sanders and Corbyn around the world, signaled in the beginning by Syriza in Greece and Podemos. There's been a massive political upheaval in this world. And it demands work. It demands jobs. It demands a response to the 2008 crisis. It demands bourgeois social relations, right? That's what it demands. And the reason, what I'm saying about the Palestinians, look, I'm a historian of South Asia. I can tell you there are a lot of places in the world that are a lot worse off than Palestine. A lot of places,
Yeah.
right? When I first went to South Asia, I thought it was going to be like my experience living in Palestine and spending time in Egypt. It's not. It's a much poorer part of the world. There are much bigger political catastrophes in this world we don't care about, like the Sudan Civil War, right? We could talk about the dispossession, the systematic dispossession of Hindus from Pakistan that takes place over decades. There are no Hindus left in Pakistan to speak of, right? Where did they go? What happened to that, right? Many people get dispossessed in this world, right? Occupied Kashmir, the Rohingya refugee crisis. We could just go on and on and on about the atrocities in this world. What we have to recognize is that there are many billions of extremely poor people with very little power to change their circumstances. Very little power to change their circumstances. And it's a cruel joke to ask them to lead the world revolution. It's a cruel joke to ask them to lead the political change that we have the ability in the first world to make. We have the rights to do it. We have the freedoms to do it. Maybe they're not here right now. They need to be asserted. They can be vindicated, even if they're not just ready to hand, right? And I think that, I will say to the Marxism is dead, socialism is dead, let's forget about Marx, let's forget about Lenin, let's forget about all of that, is that it's not done with us. There is nothing that has taken that project's place, and that project's failure is all that is happening in the world. The unfolding of the failure of socialism is the phenomenal expression of that is all the events in the news. No other project has taken its place, right? That's why, and you're not just going to go out there and empirically discover the world that you live in and find some other project, right? Because history accumulates, right? And the failures of the past and the defeats of the past are with us now. And we have neither met that task nor put anything else in its place. And that's why young people, again and again, generation after generation, are going to turn back to Marx. They're going to say, what was that thing about again? when our discontents possess us, when we want a new world, when we want to change the world. What was that old man, Vladimir Lenin, talking about again? There isn't something else that young people can't just walk outside the door, or for that matter, old people, because I don't agree that only the young are revolutionary. You can't just look out the window or walk out onto the street and say, oh, this is what the world really is, and there must be some new project here. If I only had seen it before. It's not going to be like that. That's all I have to say.
I just want to say thank you to everybody on the panel for your remarks thus far. After hearing everybody's initial remarks, I was kind of left with a perspective that we're kind of at a 50-50 divide. We have two people who are insisting that we are still living inside history, and two people who have declared that history ended at some moment in the 20th century. So,
Wait, who was who?
yourself and also Greg.
Okay.
So, if you say that history ended with the failure of the American and socialist revolutions, or that history ended with the undoing of peasants, why still build the Mass Workers' Party today?
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about this question as I was preparing my remarks. I don't think that there is going to be a mass workers' party. I think the mass workers' party is an artifact of the late 19th century. It's never coming back. And people don't have the forms of sociability. The mass workers' party doesn't even exist in Europe anymore in a real way. I think what we can do is we can resist the unfolding of the law of value on our lives as best we can. That is inherently a losing struggle. You know, we're like the Staffordshire Potters of the 19th century or whatever. But that's our historical role, is just to be ground down under the bulldozer and try to, be the Rachel Corries of the bulldozer industry.
I think it's interesting to, the remark that the law of value is still unfolding, right? What I would say is that to the extent that history is over, nevertheless, to the extent that the 19th century especially is over, maybe I think you said the forms of sociability are no longer there. I think there's a lot to that. Nevertheless, we understand our world in 19th century terms. The era of what I call the period of human freedom is what gave us the law of value, right? 1776, Adam Smith, there it is, right? Those are still our social relations to the extent that they are recognizable at all, right? Our sociality and the problem that we're in is in the terms of categories that we've inherited, right? So on the one hand, we struggle to re-achieve history, which I agree may not look like what it once did. I think it's impossible to imagine that it would. Nevertheless, we're dealing with capitalism and democracy. And those two things aren't unrelated. Those two things are intimately related. And we cannot understand our society or our politics without those categories. Both of those categories are 19th century categories. Both of those categories are the categories of Karl Marx in terms of critically understood, right? And so I think that, in some ways, there's a lot that's new. I agree that there's a real struggle and a real opacity to see the way the world is now. Because I don't think that social life appears to us through like empirical sociological investigation or something like that. I think it appears to us to the extent that we're actually trying to change it. Right? I think our ability to understand it is connected to our ability to change it, and therefore I think that it's our inability to change it right now leaves us with the categories that were given to us by the last viable project of freedom. Right? And at some level, we have to bury that past. We have to bury the project of socialism. It may not be a project of a workers' party for socialism in the 21st century. At the same time, I don't think that we can meaningfully articulate what it is we're trying to do, except in some sense, the workers of this world, those who are capable of being organized and developing their capacities politically, winning the battle of democracy. I don't see any other language that anyone really offers that substitutes for that or represents anything other than a variation upon that theme.
I may take a bit of my moderator's privilege to ask my question real quick.
But people can line up, right?
Yeah, people are welcome to line up to ask their questions, regardless of if there's a question already being asked. So I wanted to note that we have a unique condition on a Platypus panel where we have this kind of generational sweep, right? We have like a, if I may assume, like, you know, a Zoomer, a millennial, Gen X, Boomer. And I wanted to, that reminded me of a kind of condition of this topic that I think has been somewhat elided, which is the question of historical transmission, right? How does the teacher teach the student history on the left? Mike, you raised that there are lessons learned, and these lessons learned are, you know, learned over the course of years and communicated to, you know, the next cadre in the PLP. Leith and Greg, you, on the other hand, it seems like history has this kind of like character of recovery against annihilation, whether it's like the annihilation of peasantry into wage labor, or in your case, like a gruesome annihilation of like the Palestinian people, right, and recovery of history from that. So we have these two images of history, but I want to know how this ought to be communicated and passed on in time, so that it doesn't. I wonder if the communication of history could be something more than just being confronted by history every single generation, terrified by it, and then, like you said, like every new generation has to start that process anew. Where does the teacher stand in this, and where does the student stand in this?
I mean, I'm not really sure exactly what you're asking, but I think that there's still a working class in this country. I think that workers have the ability to shut down society and bring about social change. I think, you know, if you think about it, the workers in public transit, the workers that turn on the electricity every day, the workers that grow the food, the workers that run the communication system, those workers have real power. If they're organized and understand that we need a better type of society and have some understanding of what that society is about, you can bring that about. And to me, that's a communist society where relationships are not based on exploitation, where you don't sell your labor power to a capitalist, but rather where workers get together and decide what to do with their labor power. Some of it they use for themselves, the rest they use it for the rest of the community to help it develop and move forward. So, I mean, I think that's a reasonable vision of the future. I think there's the social agents available in society to bring that about, and we need to organize them, help them develop those struggles, and bring about that type of social transformation.
It's a really good question in terms of this question of historical transmission. I guess what I would say is, so there's kinds of historical transmission that are extremely valuable, and it's things like, how do you organize the kind of strike that brought those workers together in the metro, you know, in the 70s, right? These are material questions that in some ways have to do with human relationships that, you know, they do change over time, but they're skills that are invaluable and that are all too easily lost in an era where organizing is not as common as it used to be. I think those skills need to be transmitted intergenerationally in a very valuable way. Then there's another layer of this, which is what Spencer was alluding to, this idea that, when a young person has a political awakening, Marxism is the first thing they stumble on usually. And I think that that's probably true, that will continue to be the case. And I think I agree that there's no alternative political project that's going to take the form of that. In the 90s, people thought it was going to be anarchism, but that hasn't really panned out. But I think the task of the teacher in that situation is to help the student break out of the trap that imposes. Because I think the lesson of Marxism, in some ways, in the wrong hands, it can just become an all-purpose answer to every question that results in just like a completely dogmatic attitude towards existing social reality. And no one person can survive for very long on the left without having thought their way out of it in some way. And the teacher's task has to be to make that possible, I think.
A few things. I would say, I'm somebody who studies Palestinian history, but just to say, I stumbled upon Fanon first, before. Of course, that's you could say an intermediary between myself and Marx. But I do want to say that the UNRWA system that's completely decimated today by the Americans and the Israelis used to, for a long time, be a place where Palestinians and Palestinian revolutionaries like George Habash, as example, the founder of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, would be, many of them were teachers. Many of the revolutionaries and the ones who, resistance fighters, were educated and teachers at the UNRWA system. And there was there's studies, there's a PhD student here at Georgetown who's doing work on the works, looking at the role of women in revolution and looking at how many of them were teachers. She interviewed them, and there was something inside of like what they were doing. It wasn't a disutility, a job, something for wage. It was like a form of resisting the occupier, and in a way to ensure that Palestine was never forgotten, and as well to ensure that those that are being educated in that classroom had the attitude that you were to take this knowledge and you were to use it for your own emancipation, and to be politically aware that there was no this. Even a part of like many of them who ended up going to the Gulf and building the Gulf for the sheikhs, many of them would send money back and they would support the PLO and they would give money for the PLO to go and to first, this study is not being done. Palestinians don't want to talk about it too much, but a lot of the elites in the Gulf would be sending money for weapons to be bought for the PLO, so they're able to resist the Israelis. And as well, think about Lebanon before '82, before the Israelis decimated the Palestinians there. A lot of that infrastructure and the institutions that Palestinians held in Lebanon were funded by those that were educated in the UNRWA system and that had gone and built capitalist lives in the Gulf. So there is the UNRWA system is a place, not just the teacher. It's also the environment, the conditions, living in a camp, destituted and cramped in areas. That with the right attitude and the right sort of political project or political goal, it creates enough space for them to actually have their own institutions. So I think to that, yeah. No, sorry.
We should try and limit the responses a little bit, otherwise we're never going to get through this stuff.
I was just going to say that, I think that, no, we have 3 people from the academy here. We should recognize that Mike's organization and other leftist organizations are educational. That they are teachers of the left and of its history. And while I'm sure that I disagree with the way that history might be taught, and I've indicated some of those disagreements already, I do think that when you try to divorce the study of history from the question of freedom, it becomes quite uninteresting and really miserable. And I think it's happened on a massive scale in the universities and in really the wider world today, where just endless amounts of utterly forgettable writing takes place and utterly pointless research. Not everything that happened in the past is history, right? And so I think that, and I would also say that we inherit, on the one hand, I would say that our entire imagination comes from Mike's generation, from the New Left, from the generation of the 1960s. I don't think that the millennial left really broke out of that. I know that my generation didn't even have a project. My generation was just a continuation of the New Left in the 1980s in terms of like Nicaragua solidarity or whatever, 90s anarchism. It was really a rehash of the 60s and 70s on a degraded level. The millennials attempted to reckon with the legacy of the New Left, I believe, but ultimately abandoned it in favor of capitalist politics. What it leaves us is that, one of the things that it leaves us, specifically with request to this issue of teachers and students, is the New Left's retreat into the university that took place in the 1970s and 80s, and the so-called Long March to the institutions. And now we have like a second and third generation of academic leftism, which is really a pointless endeavor, right? Because you get people who are trying to replicate something without anything like the experience of trying to change the world, being a part of a movement, being a part of a party. There's nothing that motivates what they're doing. And it's just a kind of a gesture. And it involves all sorts of pseudo-radical posturing that I would really warn students against. Right, and in fact, a real teacher is going to tell you that it's just a bourgeois form of knowing. The study of the past is writing a history book is no different from what Edward Gibbon did a very long time ago. Eric Hobsbawm or Christopher Hill or any of the rest of them, they're just writing a bourgeois history on certain topics. Right, there isn't a way to write it any other way. It would be like trying to write a novel that wasn't a bourgeois work of art. It can't be done. And the best you can hope for is that it's self-aware and self-conscious of its limitations as a knowledge form, which ultimately is not going to, it has to be processed through a wider question of trying to change the world. That education.
Do you want to take all three questions?
Let's do one question at a time. We do have time in this room, so I want to give each question their due.
We got, what, till 10?
Is my clock wrong? It's 9:15 right now.
How long?
Yes, till 10.
So this isn't going to be a very organized question, my apologies, but basically my central thing was specifically with Greg's like doomerism, which I guess is corroborated by other panelists. So it's like, well, I guess the one question, and I'm also sympathetic to like this doomerism, by the way, but I guess like some question that I have in my mind, and I think I ran into it when I was actually reading like Bataille somewhere. Anyway, it's this question, I guess, that I have of reactionaries and the rise of this sort of proletarianized society. And I mean, we see this like even after the French Revolution with like Chateaubriand, and then, you know, you also see this like, you know, like with the integralists, but you also see this with fascists, etc. Oh, I guess fascists maybe are not reactionaries, but you get the point, right? There's always this sort of like diversion or this sort of lack of self-consciousness as to the origins of capitalism that is present within institutions that are upholding capitalism. So I guess my question is, and especially, and I guess this relates also to why like this, I guess Marxism and this project is so popular in these like proletarianized societies, even if there is no concrete way of being able to like pinpoint as to why it's so popular, or as to what one should do with that inclination. And so I guess my question to especially Greg would be that if it truly is the case that there is no revolutionary inclination, or if, you know, it really is this totalizing force, I guess this sort of like post-peasant society or proletarianized society, why is it that there seems to be this sort of lack or this sort of contradiction that is within every single manifestation of these societies that these societies are yet unable to recognize? And I guess as a corollary, would socialism, I guess in that case, involve just stripping away a lot of these anachronisms from like capitalism? Because of course capitalism uses these things to sustain itself, right? It's not just, aesthetics, but it seems to also actively use like different periods like religion or certain social values, etc., as a way of maintaining its social cohesion during given during given iterations of itself. I guess, like I said, it's a long-winded question, but I don't know if that makes sense, or if I'm butchering it or something.
No, I think this makes sense. I would say that every social form contains a lack. So if you look at feudalism, right, there are millenarian movements every 20 years in medieval Europe that basically all call back to the same supposedly primeval state of nature where everyone was equal, property was shared in common, there was a kind of like no laws, no property, all this kind of stuff, right? And I think that reflected a sort of mentality that feudalism was not satisfying the needs of everyone in that population, which was true. And I think Marxism functions as that sort of like mythical lack in the West, although not even Marxism, I mean, just a kind of generalized revolutionary consciousness that cloaks itself in a kind of Marxist language often, in a variety of different ways. I don't think that in itself is an indication that of a promise or anything that's going to be necessarily realized. It's just a mark that human societies are inherently going to be exploitative. Theoretically it's possible to have a communist society, but in practice, I think it's just people are haunted by the unrealized fantasy that their social order promises them. And Marxism is to some people at least, a kind of, and you can see this in a lot of surveys of workers in the late 19th century, like the SPD would do. What do you want? I want to and they would ask them things like, I want a full belly. I want to settle accounts with the capitalists. I want to, spend my spare time reading. And it would just be like this kind of list of things that are quite utopian, but it didn't really have anything to do with socialism. It's just this. It sucks to be a worker. These are just things that you want to have fixed in your life. So yeah, I mean, I don't know what to make of that. I think it's inescapable. But is it a driver of social change? Not inherently, I would say.
But I guess isn't it sorry, I don't want to take up too much time. But isn't it just a fundamental problem within the account itself? It makes the account problematic, which leaves room for its destruction, I guess you could say. In the same way that for example, feudalism had these problems, and so that made way for, I guess, this post-feudalist account. I guess couldn't this also be the case with capitalism, I guess, that it's not totalizing then?
I think that's entirely possible. If so, I have not seen the indication of what that would look like, or if that would indeed be a more just social order than what we currently have. Because historically, I actually disagree with Spencer. I think that in many ways, the solution to feudalism was worse than a disease in many cases.
Yeah.
And so the way things are going, it doesn't seem like the solutions will be much better.
Can I say something? I just wanted to say about the doomerism. The doomerism is a function of the fact that there was a leftist project that was sort of fleetingly constituted in the anti-Iraq war and the era of Occupy and the Arab Spring and the moment of Podemos and Syriza that chose, that ultimately was led into the Democratic Party and the Labor Party and Die Linke, etc. And that's the reason why there's the doomerism now, because everyone realizes that that's completely bankrupt. Everyone realizes it. Like Mondani, AOC, this is no way forward. Everybody knows it. Right? And that's the doom that hovers over the panel and the present, right? The fact of the matter is that whether we have a catastrophic war in the Middle East in yesterday is got nothing to do with any leftist anywhere in the world. We are absolutely powerless. We have no control whatsoever, and we have done nothing with the past 20 years, except create another generation of cynical and depoliticized people, right?
Who is we? I don't know. I've been doing.
Well, there is history that has taken place. There are events that have taken place. There was an attempt to reconstitute the left in a very degraded way, right? And the sense of doom isn't just our existential situation of, you know, being conscious and alive, right? It's a function of where we are now and the very felt sense of utter historical helplessness. Utter historical helplessness in the present, right? I don't agree at all that there were millenarian movements every 20 years under feudalism, right? There were a lot of...
It's called the Pursuit of the Millennial. It's like from 60 years ago. It's pretty interesting.
It's pretty interesting, but it's also the end of the feudal era, right? If you're looking at 400 to 1400, there is no documented millenarian movement every 20 years in Europe or in India or in China or anywhere else. I can tell you that there was a millenarian movement every year in India in the 19th century because there was a colonial state there to document it, right? That there were peasant uprisings, there were tribal uprisings of all sorts, but those things happened in the past without being recorded and without having any impact whatsoever, right? There's no history in medieval Europe or in medieval anywhere, really, in the sense of the people changing their circumstances in any conscious way, right? People just rebelling isn't changing anything. That may have happened. There may be slave revolts in the Roman Empire. I would imagine that for every slave revolt we know about, there are 1,000 we don't. Right? But the fact that we don't know about them is itself telling. Right? We know about everything that's happened in the era of bourgeois society. Right? If only from European sources.
I would just say I'm using oral history for sources because I think it's worthwhile to say that's not just the written word, but there are other forms of historical documentation. But yeah.
Sure.
Thanks so much. So my question is primarily regarding the question of technology. So technology or mass communication has completely changed our life through the 20th and 21st century. There's no doubt about it. And I think my biggest despair, as like partially like my leftist me, is the despair on the left counter tactic or tactics towards the rise of mass technology. That I think like the development of AI, for example, there's no leftist agenda whatsoever to understand how AIs would function regarding the near future that we're coming to existence in. Maybe Varoufakis is kind of like feudal capitalism synthesis. It's a kind of, I don't know, it's also a millenarian prediction on the future. But that's why I feel like the nationalist agenda may have not failed completely, since the nationalist model is the only model where AIs could be developed, since we have not seen such evidence of showing how technology could be developed in a massive base kind of economy, since there's no precedence on this. And also, how, as leftists, how should we understand the topic of AI in the current circumstances, like based on our understanding of its essence and of its utilities?
Well, I think we should understand AI in the same way we understood the invention of the steam engine, the invention of the electric motor. They all increased labor productivity dramatically, and they led to much better working conditions for millions and millions of people. And we should try and make sure that AI is used in the same way. It will make labor more productive. That means we can work less hours and still maintain the same standard of living.
Yeah, I don't really know what to say about it, to be honest. I think What we can say is modern forms of communication do make communication easier in a certain way, but they also channel it in a way that makes it more easily controllable and manipulatable and undermines the forms of sociability that have historically been the strength of left-wing movements. So I think the more we can learn to stay offline, the stronger we'll be. Maybe that's an old crank thing to say, despite the fact that I'm the millennial representative on the panel.
I mean, I think there's also something to be said about how AI requires data centers that are going to continue to degrade the environmental catastrophe that we're in. We're heading towards as well. And to Greg and what I was thinking about, like the overpopulation, the environmental crisis is going to overwhelmingly harm those in the global south, and it's going to accelerate that the death of the third world. And the poor. You see places like Madagascar, which are reaching everywhere in the world is reaching like record-breaking temperatures. But it's going to kill these people. They're going to migrate, and it's going to with Europe cementing its border and the north of Africa, securitizing it. I think that's what we should be worried most about. But I also do believe I agree with Greg. Like we need to stay offline. I mean, how do you mobilize each other? Everything is the AI and these governments and these authoritarian states can really track you if you're using these technologies. I also highly recommend us getting offline as well.
I mean, first of all, I would say that artificial intelligence is as old as humanity, right? Our society is an artificial intelligence that is greater than any individual. Its norms, its language, its rituals, its practices, none of us, no individual created. And all of it accumulates over time. It builds, right? It builds libraries, it builds very complex processes of sustaining social memory. And then it develops into, as was said here, into the systematic systematic application of science and technology to the reproduction of society, right? And that's what capitalism is about, right? The Industrial Revolution is most certainly artificial intelligence, right? What we're going to get with AI is not just the freedom from labor and the productivity of the Industrial Revolution. We're also going to get the unemployment and the misery and the mass conformity and the social control of the Industrial Revolution, right? It's not the case that the Industrial Revolution is an unmitigated gain for humanity. What it's going to look like is mass unemployment, further unemployment. We already live in seas of lumpenization, right? People who are it's a street hustle for billions of people in the world today, right? That's going to continue. That's going to increase. That's why we have to. That's why I think the question of large-scale democratic movements is going to be very important, right? Because the people are so precariously employed that it's the idea of rebuilding a socialist workers' movement, I think, is potentially no longer possible. But on the ecological question, I'm very grateful to Donald Trump for reminding us, I think very valuably, that the world's not going to end in ecological disaster. The world's going to end in war. That's how this society's going to end. We can see it all over the place. We don't this idea that somehow nature is going to fail as some kind of external phenomenon. No, humanity is in an ongoing way barbarizing itself, destroying itself, creating epidemics, right, through essentially wargaming, right? We can see this all around us, right? So I think the idea that there's some sunny, all too sunny day in the future where the world's just too hot, right? No, it's not going to look like that, right?
we live in a society that's utterly unpacified, that's at war with itself. And it breaks out in geopolitical ways, it breaks out in form of crime, breaks out in form of young people wilding through the streets and mass antisocial behavior. Right? We see it in all kinds of ways of dystopia. And what AI is of course the potential for what Mike is talking about. The abolition of labor. Right? That humanity has never known anything but labor. And capitalism has raised the question of what would the point of life be if it weren't a struggle? And we stave off the consciousness of that, right? The lack of the necessity of our social relations. The fact that we ought to have overcome capitalism 100 years ago is the deepest historical memory that we can possibly have. And it's unbearable, right? It would actually drive you mad to think about how unnecessary the entirety of the world is, right? And that it's ultimately a failure of our own struggle with our own freedom, right? So, this question of AI, it's a question of a world beyond work. And we've been there for so long. The Industrial Revolution has a project right now for alleviating abolishing labor. It's called mass unemployment. It's everywhere, and it is the problem. So AI is not going to solve this problem. It's going to deepen this problem, because it's going to create more and more people who are desperate for work, who are therefore willing to undermine other people's wages, who are going to be willing to work for less and less money, who are going to be willing to conform, to politically obey, to show how obedient they are to everyone in authority, something that we see all the time around us anyway, right? So I don't think that I don't think that Marxism is anything other than very much a thought about technology. Right, but I would caution you against thinking that just because you're young and you've come along and there's this thing called AI, that the question of technology has been posed for the first time in human history. It isn't, right? And it's social, what it means politically is definitely, again, a thought that goes back to Marxism. And really nothing else. Everything else is just, a kind of accommodation to it or hoping that it's going to solve our problems.
Thank you, everyone, for your comments and also for your fortitude at this hour. As Spencer pointed out earlier, we have 3 academic historians or historians to be, and 1 avid reader of history in Mike. Spencer, you invoked Gibbon, but of course, history as we practice it, as historians practice it, is born in the 18th century, in the 1800s rather. It's a product of German historicism. And I guess we date it here in the American historical establishment to von Ranke, but it's obviously he is an heir to a tradition of German historicism. And it's interesting to me how deeply the project of history for the left and history as a discipline are bound up. Von Ranke's teacher, Schleiermacher, was, sort of organizes this early thinking about history as a discipline in contradistinction to Hegel. He was a famous enemy of Hegel. He's trying to sort of do away with the philosophy of history, give history its own autonomy. And I'm thinking about the fact that in thinking about your comments, Greg, that it's only the people who have been deproletarianized in this way who have the peculiar kind of consciousness we call academic history. It's not a thing that exists before that moment, and perhaps it's bound up with its crisis. I was reading Peter Novick's book on sort of the American historical establishment, or the American historical profession, and he notes that there's like every time there's like a crisis in the objectivity crisis is like tied to all these crises elsewhere in the left as well, right? And Hayden White like similarly makes this point that there's like a crisis in history that's tied to like the problem that there's like an unworked through relationship to history in like the doing of history and working it out. And I mean, Leith, your invocation of Saidiya Hartman is like, Venus in Two Acts is like in some ways like nothing more than like an attempt to like try to like do something with this history that's been like so damaged or left. I guess I just want to, since it was one of the questions on the on the prompt, I guess I wanted to invoke this. Like what do we do with this like weird, fraught relationship between the historical discipline and history as it appeared to the left in all these various like forms or shapes, or if there is even still any kind of meaningful relationship. Perhaps not.
I do want to say that I agree with what Spencer said earlier about the nature of academic left history. I think that there is a kind of cargo cult vibe to it, where it's just like there is a kind of like rote performance of familiar gestures, and I mean it's overlaying that on the jobs crisis, right? I don't know where do we go. I think that is going to have to peter. I think it seems like with the current academic situation, it's going to have to peter itself out somehow, or rather, the kind of like connection between the new left style and the historical academy. And it is already like the stuff that's coming out is often more conservative than it would be even 20 years ago. But I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what that means in terms of the left, because what I'm seeing on the left is like a fixation on certain kinds of writers or certain kinds of historians that are often very marginal in a way that, like people like Grover Furr or somebody, who's not even really a historian, but, or whatever. Actually, you know what? I shouldn't gatekeep. He's a historian. He's just not a good historian. Anyway.
Good friend of mine. I've known him for 50 years.
All right, I'm sure he's great, but he's a terrible historian. But I mean, there's a lot of people like that. I mean, what I would like to see is a history that's more Weberian and more focused on actually writing what happened, as opposed to a kind of like ideological reproduction of what happened. Although, of course, everything is ideological, but there should be a greater effort to figure out. Just I don't know. I think objectivity. There are some stakes to a kind of performance of objectivity, at least. But on the other side, I think on the left there should be an attempt to read that history critically and use it for real ends, to the extent that the left is still going to exist, which is also an open question. But beyond that, I don't know. I think the crisis is in part internal and in part external, and the external dimensions of the crisis are far less controllable or even imaginable in the 10 to 15 year time span than the internal ones. Sorry, that was
Yeah, I would say that those figures of the 1830s and 40s, like Leopold von Ranke or Thomas Babington Macaulay or Jules Michelet or the American George Bancroft, it's a whole generation of people. I would think of them like the young Hegelians. That they are expressing the crisis of the relationship of the present to the past. And that's why you're getting the birth of positivist history there, where you're getting the birth of relativism there, etc. Right? You'll see the same things amongst those historians that you'll see debated, between the young Hegelians in that period, or among socialists in that period. Right? It's the crisis of bourgeois thought that's giving rise to that kind of professional history, right? But there's a second birth of professional history that I'm sure your advisors are going to tell you about, which is you can't cite Thomas Babington Macaulay or von Ranke or anything else. The citable literature the literature that is the modern historical profession is what's written after World War I. Right? That's the modern discipline. You can't have a historiographical debate with somebody from the 19th century. People will think you're insane, right? But you can have a debate still, I would imagine, you could still cite in Russian history something like E.H. Carr, reputably, right? As some kind of venerable, position. And what you're seeing there is, again, a replication of the crisis of bourgeois thought, this time in the wake of socialism, right? The first crisis is with the emergence of socialism and the class struggle. That's what you're seeing in the 30s and 40s. I would say that, just as a footnote, the last of the great young Hegelians who's thinking these thoughts about the crisis of history writing is Nietzsche on the uses and disadvantages of history for life, which is a completely young Hegelian text. What you're seeing in the true professionalization of the discipline is what I was referring to as the American century. This afterlife of historylessness in the wake of socialism, right? And that's where you get this problem of professionalism for its own sake, a kind of ultimate incoherence about what is history versus just kind of the past, things that people did in the past. The difference in that sense between like chronicling something and genuinely writing history. So I think that all the same problems that Marxists and philosophers tend to talk about with respect to the crisis of German idealism, young Hegelians, 19th century neo-Kantianism, etc., the emergence of sort of logical positivism and fundamental ontology, a kind of Heidegger versus positivist philosophy. The same thing is reproduced in other disciplines, and you'll see it in, for instance, history, right? Maybe not as self-consciously, because there is this, in a sense, program of telling the story of the past, which involves research, and you tend to get kind of research archive bugs in this discipline. Right? You really don't know why they're doing it. They're good friends to have to sort of help you with research, but otherwise kind of nutty. That's what I would say is that those things aren't outside the frame, right? Because there's a genuine, what's underlying is the genuine crisis between the past and the present, right? That Marx is analyzing in terms of the accumulation of capital. Right? That's what you're seeing in these kind of different modalities of historiography.
As a note, we have 15 minutes left, so this will probably be the last question, and then we'll move to closing remarks.
Thank you. I think I want to address this specifically to you, Mike, and something that you brought up earlier, which is the Progressive Labour Party's attempt maybe to break from a past history of nationalism or of, apologies, I can't remember the other point that you made. But I want to situate this in light of something that you, Leith, said about the Hartman quote, which is that the attempt to take up history is the attempt to mediate or create a different narrative for oneself as a project. And something that you said, Greg, as well, about how all these narratives on the left recently, or I don't know how long you would say for, are just like rationalizations for failure over the past 70 years. And also what you've been saying, Spencer, about there being a real project to take up history in the recent past. So on that note, I would be interested in hearing how all of you would articulate one of the questions of the panel, which is, what is the relationship of an organized party, or what is the role of a party in mediating between the past and the present? How does the party take up historical memory? And either historically or maybe prospectively, how could this be a task for the left today? Thank you.
I mean, progressive labor, we looked at the history of the Russian Revolution, we looked at the history of the Chinese Revolution, we looked at the socialist movements throughout Europe, throughout North and South America, all around the world, and we tried to figure out why did they get off course? Why have they not led to more equality, less racism, less sexism? Why have they just sort of reproduced a capitalist society with a little different form, but the same type of social relationships that existed in the prior societies? And he said that we've come to the conclusion that they did not win large numbers of people to a communist vision of the future. And they did not, really fight for those ideas with masses of people. Now, we don't think that you have to have everybody believing in communism before a revolution. That's very idealistic. But we think you do have to have a significant number of people that have a different vision of the type of social relationships that should exist in a new society. And to the extent that you've created that base and you make a revolution, you can expand those relationships to a broader and broader section of the people who will then accept the idea of abolishing the wage system, ending racism, ending nationalism, and building a more collective, cooperative society going forward.
So the two parties whose educational programs I'm most familiar with are PSL and DSA, although I've never been a PSL member. But my understanding of how PSL does it is basically they have a reading list that all of the would-be party applicants have to work their way through in like a guided reading group kind of style, and the idea is to hammer the party dogma into their heads in such a way that they can then parrot it online and in person with people who are there discussing with. My impression is that this results in people who don't know the material very well and are just sort of told to repeat cliches. And it doesn't result in a good knowledge of history, or an accurate knowledge of history either. The other party is DSA. And then DSA, the way this works is basically people pick and choose from history. They do like different reading groups, or there's like a night school that by an academic or by an expert on some topic. And then you have these kind of patches of knowledge that you fill in with things that you're kind of interested in here and there. And the result of that is basically that people just kind of are drawn to what they're already interested in and drawn to stuff that confirms what they already believe in a way that seems kind of academic. And you can more or less find leftist works to confirm anything you already want to believe. And so the result is that people in DSA have this kind of vague soup of ideas in their heads, but can't really give you a historical account in most cases that is particularly coherent. I think both of these are problematic. I think a better approach would be to focus on the economic and the social landscape of this specific site in which you are politically active. So I was politically active in the tenant group within DSA, and we did a lot to read about how the tenant movement in DC evolved in the 1960s, what the housing situation is like, why the economic geography of DC is the way it is, and basically looking at the development of specific kinds of social relations, not from the vantage point of like who offers the most ideologically consistent or the most ideologically pleasing narrative, but from the point of view of gaining information and experience that will inform practical action. And that also includes talking with activists who were active in this space before and who were active in different organizing projects in DC in the past and why they failed or in what ways did they succeed. I think that there could have been more to do with that, but I think it was a much more successful approach than either of the first two, in part because people were able to take that knowledge and relate it directly to their own lives. And I think that the role of history in a leftist context should be subordinated to the kinds of actual things people are doing in the real world.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I would say that to the PLO's credit for Oslo, a lot of these people up until like the 90s, you really had, the Nakba is ongoing. So Palestinians in their sort of historical understanding and their teaching was very much experiential. It was about their location and the reminder of the occupation is always constant. And so history kind of is living throughout the occupation. So there wasn't the need to, overly go into, like, there was a lot of analysis by the PLO Research Center that invested a lot of money and a lot of resources, a lot of manpower to sort of documenting and to discuss the effects and the theories of settler colonialism. I mean, like the earliest work on settler colonialism, that predates actually Patrick Wolf, who's in the West is seen as like the sort of father of settler colonialism. It's like Fayez Sayegh, who wrote in 1965 about Israeli settler colonialism, demarcating the fact that the Israelis have a clear plan. And so the Palestinians always knew that there was an expansionist project, even in their schools and the curriculum. And that's why after Oslo, there was a huge emphasis by the Israelis to police the history books that were being taught. And that's why still today it's a contentious project, a contentious topic, that even among when the Israelis are trying to target UNRWA, there was this complete UNRWA had to amend its history textbooks that were teaching in its schools, because on the maps, for example, Palestine always featured. There was never in Israel, and that's a way to remind and to politicize the past and the present, and to remind people that there's a political goal in historical documentation. And you can talk about there hasn't been too much work onto the historical validity of the textbooks, again because it's a very contentious topic. But now there has been calls by people like Hassan Abu Sitta, who I cited, who I find to be critiquing and calling for a rehistoricization and looking at what went wrong in the Palestinian history for that Palestinian liberation movement went towards Oslo and went to decapitation and collaboration. And so there is going to be now a new scholarship, definitely a new scholarship. There has been a new scholarship being merged since 2005, nevertheless. But I think to your question on what role does the party, there will be alternative parties because now, the PLO and Fatah and Hamas completely decimated. And Fatah just completely delegitimized on the eyes of Palestinians. That there is going to be an alternative movement, an alternative party. Whether it's born from the diaspora, that's another topic, that's another conversation, but there will always be an emphasis that it has to be led by the Palestinians on the inside. And not just Palestinians in the occupied territories, the 48ers from the land occupied in 48, Palestinians there, and there's a recognition that they are most equipped to speak the language of Zionism and to speak to Zionists, because they know how to, they live in that system to navigate that system. Yeah.
I would say that, in some sense, the party question on the left is the name of the deepest sort of trauma, the most sort of unbearable memory, because it was in and through the party and the statification of the party that Marxism was liquidated and socialism betrayed. And at the same time, all of the attempts to step aside from that problem, all of the rebirths of anarchism that we've seen as a way of sidestepping the problem of party ends up facing the fact that capitalism is organized through party politics, right? That Marxists didn't take up the party form because they thought it was a good idea or we need a vanguard party or whatever. What they saw was the emergence of mass democracy in the 19th century. And they saw the way that the European working class, the socialist working class, was attracted to engaging the battle of democracy in this party political form. Right? And you can see that in the debates between Marx and Lassalle over Germany. You can see it really going all the way back before Marx and Engels to the debates within Chartism and what is Chartism for? Is it a political party or is it just a demand for universal suffrage? Do you have to be a worker? All of those questions, right?
And I think that what we see over the course of the Second International, obviously at a very acute level in figures like Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, is the question of how can the working class build its strength and its capacity through a relentless history of defeat, right? And that's the problem that they pose as one of historical consciousness, right? What do we take? It's not like lessons learned. It's not like practical knowledge. Like, I built a house, and in the course of building the house, I faced that I didn't understand how to do this and that, and now I have this practical experience, so I won't make that mistake again. Right? It's not like that. But it is a question of understanding how the past is returning within capitalism. Right? How the problem of bourgeois revolution and the reconstitution, the political reconstitution of society is taking place under conditions that are self-undermining of that project. That's the problem of the Revolution of 1848. It's like the best work ever written by any historian on the Revolution of 1848 is Karl Marx's writings from the period, right? You can't study the Revolution of 1848 without reading Marx, just like you can't study 1917 without reading Lenin. In fact, nobody gives a damn about any of that unless they're interested in Marxism, right? Revolution of 1848 is completely buried. The only people who care about it are the people who care about Marx, right? And what Marx wrote is not contested by any historian. Any historian of 1848 will tell you, I love the 18th Brumaire. There's not one wrong word in the 18th Brumaire, right? There's not, what Marx wrote about the Paris Commune is the history of the Paris Commune. But there's not really some other thing. I know the anarchists get mad because no Marxist made the Paris Commune, right? But Marx is saying, what's the meaning of the way that the Proudhonists undermined their own program and became statists, and the way that the Blanquists undermined their own program and became interested in social organization, the development of ties amongst the workers. How did they point to and overcome the antinomy within socialism so as to authorize the necessity of Marxism? Right? Again, 1905. Who gives a damn about 1905? Marxists. And you can't begin to study it without reading Trotsky on 1905, without reading Lenin on 1905, without reading Rosa Luxemburg on the mass strike. Right? This question, what are they thinking about? They're not thinking about progress. It's not a story of progress. It's a story of, is it possible to bring to make this history of what? Of defeat. Because that's all it is. 1848 is a defeat. It results in imperialism. It results in Louis Bonaparte. Paris Commune is defeat. It's a couple of months and it's a defeat. 1905 is a defeat. At each stage, the capitalist state grows stronger. Right? Tsarism doesn't get weaker through the experience of 1905, it gets stronger. Right? The question is the working class getting a deeper and deeper understanding of what capitalism is in and through its defeated struggle with it? Right? That it is actually, in the attempt to change it, that capitalism actually can be known. It can't be known just by reading Das Kapital. Right? We actually won't ever know what capitalism is until we overcome it. Right? That's actually the way that you'll know fully what it is. Right? You think it's just going to make people poorer? Well, the 20th century will show that it's not making people poorer. People have better, forms of better consumption levels. We have all of the ways in which, even progress ties you to capitalism. In fact, progress is the way we're tied to capitalism now. The implication of what I was saying is, this is why I was joking, that if we achieved socialism in 1917, it would have been white supremacy. Right? Because what is that telling you? It's telling you that this young person thinks that feminism and racial equality and the development of science and technology and productivity in the 20th century, it's all due to capitalism. If we'd achieved socialism, we wouldn't have all of these wonderful things. Right? It is the progress of capitalism that is the way it reproduces itself. Right? It's why young people, right? What did Taylor Swift said? She had her decades or whatever, right? And someone asked her, "What's your favorite decade?" And she said, "The 1830s." Right? And they condemn her, right? "Oh, you're a white supremacist. In the 1830s, everyone was a slave. The women were enslaved. The black people were enslaved, right? What a torture chamber the 1830s were."
I think
right?
you're going on a little bit too long.
The question
It's
is,
not to get up for work tomorrow morning.
this will be my closing remark.
Okay.
The question of, again, the question of how do we organize within democracy? Because we reproduce capitalism through our democratic struggles. Right? How does capitalism got reproduced now? Through the Sanders campaign. That's how it got reproduced. Through Biden, through Kamala Harris, right? This is how we're going to produce a trans-friendly, post-racial, third-wave feminist capitalism, right? It is the left it is the failure of the left that is the deepest problem. That is the actual struggle of capitalism, right? Marxism is a critique of the left. That's the last thing I'll say.
So we are out of time for this room. I mean, if anyone has any very pithy closing remarks,
No, we're not.
we're good. Okay, then everyone give a hand to our panelists for this